Today in this workshop, I'm going to be talking about how we can achieve financial security by protecting your money and income for you and your loved ones, and how we go about this through legal help and advice when we are planning for illness or for when we pass away by making wills and lasting powers of attorney. Now, between 50% and 60% of the adult UK population have not made a will. I find that statistic really shocking, and I've often wondered why that is. And it's always hovered around the 60%, and I think depending on your research, the research you look at, it may be around the 50% mark, hard to know for sure. But this workshop was partly a way of addressing that and really working out, well, why don't people make wills? But we'll also be talking about lasting powers of attorney, which a lot less of the UK population have made those. And I'll be sharing stories from my 16 years of experience of helping thousands of clients with this. I'll share my personal relationship with wills and the subject of death and how my experience have helped me with not only making wills, but also the ups and downs of life. And I touched upon this a moment ago. The reason for running these workshops is because of trying to work out, well, why don't people make wills and lasting powers of attorney? But also I see the struggles that people have when it comes to making them, not knowing how to go about it, not appreciating the importance of doing it, and the consequences of not having them, and not talking about the subject. And I wanted to find a way to overcome this, really break it down, make it easy to put these protections in place with wills and lasting powers of attorney. So just before I start the workshop officially, I think a few more people are coming on to the workshop. I'd love to know whereabouts in the UK you are today. So let me know in the chat. That would be fantastic. I'm coming from Kent today, which is where I am based, which is not looking too bad. So a little bit of sunshine. We do have a Q&A function, and there'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the workshop. So if there are any questions, you could pop those in the Q&A at the end or towards the end of the workshop. We have about an hour today. And then, as I say, we have the chat function as well. So feel free to use that. As I said, I'd love to know whereabouts in the UK you are. Okay, that leads me to my first question then, which is, so do you have conversations about dying in illness? And again, I'd love to know, and again, pop in the chat for me whether this is something that you actually talk about, because I have noticed that lots of people don't, and there is this fear of talking about this subject. And I'm going to talk a lot more about this later on in the workshop, but I'd just love to know whether any of you do have those conversations already. My plan for this workshop is to give you as much guidance, information, advice as I possibly can in the hour we have together. As I've mentioned earlier, ask questions, anything you like. So no questions is off limits. And at the end, I'll be sharing how you can work with me if this is of interest. And I'll take you through my how to protect your assets and loved ones process for 5 minutes at the end. So we have a few people coming in from Scotland, from Edinburgh. So that's fantastic. Lovely part of the world. The information I'm going to be sharing with you today has come from many clients and people who have helped over the last 16 years, assisting clients with making wills, powers of attorney, probate, helping those with relatives who have dementia. It might be care funding advice. all the things which surround wills and probate law, and especially over the last 2 years since I became a self-employed consultant solicitor. And that allowed me to really understand my clients' challenges and their needs. And what I have seen is the common reasons why people fail and they struggle with making wills and lasting powers of attorney. I've mentioned the statistics at the beginning. So quite a high portion, as I say, between 50 and 60% of adults don't have a will. A lot less don't have powers of attorney. I think that is somewhere around the 80% mark. And the reasons, and I've identified these 5 key reasons why people fail to do this. And the first is they often think we have plenty of time to make them. So it's perhaps seen as something we do in later life, and it's not prioritized. And the unfortunate truth is that nobody really knows if we will get ill and when that might happen. And we don't know when we're going to pass away. Tomorrow isn't guaranteed for any of us. The second is some people will start to make their wills, powers of attorney, but they don't finish them. And I see this quite often with clients. Life gets in the way. They know it should be done, but unfortunately, it doesn't get taken through to the end. But that is just like not having a will at all. So you do need to finish them. I've mentioned this earlier, the fear of discussing death and illness. I think in the UK, it is an issue, and perhaps a societal issue. So it gets in the way, and ultimately it stops people from making the wills and powers of attorney because we're not having these conversations. The fourth is they don't appreciate how important putting these protections in place, so making our wills and lasting powers of attorney. And connected with that is they think it's simple and just a document that needs to be written. And that means we don't get help. We attempt to do it ourselves. And I'll touch upon this again a little bit more in more detail later on, but there are so many options nowadays for making our wills, from the DIY option, which is not the best option to follow. What I would love to know is which one of those relates to you. So is there one of those 5 on the screen now which you are struggling with or resonates really strongly with you? So just take a moment to reflect on that and pop in the chat for me the number of the one which you relate to the most. So what's the reason that you're perhaps struggling with making a will and lasting power of attorney at the moment? Perhaps all of them relate. So perhaps you can resonate with all of those 5 points. Again, let me know in the chat, or perhaps none of them too. I'd really love to know because it helps to really understand these reasons more. And I am going to be focusing in on all of these points in the session today. So we'll be exploring them in more detail. But say, if anybody would like to pop one of those options in the chat, which one of those 5 on the screen now do you resonate with? I'd love to know. Okay. This is how I've structured the workshop today. It's going to be in 3 parts. So we have part 1, which is protection, and this is the part we really need to focus on. So it's how we get started. Where exactly do we start with all of this? Part 2 will be support. So how do we get the right support for your own individual circumstances and make sure we get the correct advice, the correct legal advice? And then in part 3, decisions, I'll be going through how do we actually get it all done, make sure we have these protections in place and we're not starting them and not finishing them rather. And we are focusing in on actually making the decision and not procrastinating about it. Very, very briefly, for those who don't know me, I am a consultant solicitor at Richard Nelson Solicitors. I'm also a private client law trainer and a visiting lecturer at the University of Law. And during the workshop, I will talk through how I've helped my clients and share examples, which have all come from my discussions with clients and my experience of helping clients over these last 16 years. I am on a bit of a mission to educate about the importance of wills and lasting powers of attorney and to make sure everybody has these protections in place when we become ill and when we pass away. If we're not connected already on LinkedIn, I suspect most of you on the workshop today, we are already connected. But if not, I'd love to connect with you. There's a QR code there which you can use, which will take you through to my profile to connect. So please do, and do connect rather than just follow me. That would be fantastic. So we can share each other's content and get to know more about each other. Before I move into the in-depth content, I wanted to address why we should be focusing on wills and lasting powers of attorney. So why now? And this is an important point, I think, because, let's be honest, we've been through a lot over the last few years. We're still going through a lot. So why should we be focusing in on this now? And there may seemingly be lots of other important things that we need to be doing. And in all honesty, there are so many different reasons, but I wanted to highlight some of the main reasons, and we can break it down into protecting our loved ones. So protecting our family, those closest to us, or whoever we call and class as our family. The second is to protect our money and property. And then the third is to protect our income, our finances, and our business if we have one. And it's really useful here just to draw a distinction between a will and a lasting power of attorney and why they are both needed. And some of you may know the difference already. But a will is setting out what happens when you pass away, as you may know. So what's going to happen to your assets, who's going to deal with your estate, if you like, and lots of other things when you pass away. A power of attorney, a lasting power of attorney is, well, who is going to help you if you become ill and you can't make decisions during your lifetime? The focus on that is keeping your life running. Whilst your lifetime, you may become ill, but not limited to later life. So when we enter our later years. But as I say, we don't always know, well, we don't know when we could become ill. So they are important at any stage of our life. And they are both needed. So they are an extension of one another. And I mentioned a moment ago, there are lots of reasons why this is important. I'll go through some more now. We don't want to be passing away without any protections in place. And ultimately, we want to make sure that our property, the assets that we own, our money, they go to who we want and not to somebody we don't. If we own a business, it could come grinding to a halt. And that's going to mean a loss of income, a loss of business, and it could have quite drastic consequences. If we become ill, decisions can then be made, if we have our lasting powers of attorney, can be made about our finances, our health, our welfare, our care, medical decisions. It might even be as simple as keeping the house running by paying the bills, making sure you still have somewhere to live. And it's giving security to those we leave behind. And who will look after the pets? So when I help clients with wills, undoubtedly for the animal lovers, pets are so important. So again, it's making sure who's going to who's going to look after the pets rather. And that's actually one of the reasons why I update my will quite regularly, just to cater for the pets. Unfortunately, we lost our cats last year. So there may be a new pet on the horizon, so that will need updating again. But this is what can happen if we don't have a will. If we look at that slide, I mean, that is really complicated. I'm not going to hover on this slide for too long, but it just gives a really good illustration of the complexities involved if we don't have a will, we don't have a lasting power of attorney. How do we get started with all of this? And what do we need to do to put these protections into place? And this is the area that the majority don't do. And I see and notice this happening all the time when I help my clients, when I speak to people. These steps at the very beginning they're not taken. And there are three main steps. And the first is planning. The second is those important conversations I mentioned earlier. The third is making a decision. So actually deciding I'm going to do this, I'm going to make sure that it's in place. And most, unfortunately, do think that making wills and lasting powers of attorney are simple and easy to do. And they are perhaps just this document that they know and should have. And particularly when I started as a self-employed solicitor, I really began to notice this. In fact, I changed completely how I see helping my clients. So I've changed as a lawyer and in the advice I give. So I realized that, actually making wills and powers of attorney, it's such a big life event. And it is very much about life and not necessarily just about death. But what we need to do is give it some context. So we need to have a think about, well, what assets do we have? What liabilities do we have? What are we actually protecting? Let's draw up our family tree. Let's work out who our loved ones are. Because surprisingly, people don't necessarily go into that much detail. They may have an idea of those closest, but for people who have extended families, for people who have remarried or have children from previous relationships, this is really, really important. And actually for anybody, because it may be that we want to think about leaving our sentimental items to a close friend or to another family member. We might want to give money to charity. And we need to make these wishes known and record them in a tangible form. So it's not just the will and power of attorney document, it's a letter of wishes. So it's another useful way of really planning out the detail, thinking about, well, what do my loved ones, our business partners, if you have a business, what do they actually need to know about me? Because I suspect for a lot of people, and I've seen this through the clients I help, they won't know that, and their loved ones won't know a lot about their life, but they will be expected at some point to be helping them when they pass away, dealing with the estate, if they become ill. How are they going to know who someone banks with, for example? A really simple example. How are they going to know all this? And this is what I helped John, Paul, and Ben with. And this was really important to them. And this is, so just to say, not my sorry, not clients' real names. So for confidentiality reasons, I have to keep the names secret. But these are examples from the clients I help over the years. So for John, Paul, and Ben, this was a real concern and worry because their house, so their home, they lived together, was just in John Paul's name. They also had various personal effects. So they wanted to make sure that those also passed down to the correct people, their loved ones, their family members. They did have business interests, but this was more on the retirement side, so they had an income coming on from business interests, and that really needed to be discussed and recorded. They wanted to set out, well, what's going to happen, or what would I like to happen if we become ill? So that was a real concern for John Paul and Ben, and also setting out how they would like to be cared for in later life. And also because the home was just in John Paul's name, they wanted to think about the finance side. So was there a possibility of equity release in the future if care needed to be paid for, and how is that going to affect Ben? And John Paul and Ben, they had started to make the wills and powers of attorney, but they had ultimately got stuck because of these conflicting concerns. There was a lot going on. It wasn't until the planning stage, until all this is drawn out. And they also needed a certificate provider for the lasting powers of attorney. So when you go through making lasting powers of attorney, you need a person who can certify or clarify, if you like, that the person making the power of attorney, they understand what they're doing, they have mental capacity, so the ability to actually make a power of attorney. And somebody needs to sign that off and be involved in the process. What did we do together? So this was where the letter of wishes was really, really important. So we've actually recorded who we're going to manage the business interest, made sure that the personal effects went to the correct people, and we then set out what John Paul and Ben really wanted if John Paul became ill, because he was the owner of the house, but also for Ben as well. What if they needed care, if they became ill? How were they going to keep their finances running, keep their business running, make those important medical decisions? I acted as the certificate provider, which I do when I help clients make lasting powers of attorney. That meant that they didn't have the stress of finding someone else to do it, explaining what they needed to do, explaining what their role in this process was. And then once it was all done, they had peace of mind and security. You know, their assets were secure, they knew what was going to happen. And more importantly, Ben knew that he wouldn't be left without a home. The second area that the majority don't do, or they don't have, is these important conversations, which I talked about earlier. And I have mentioned this earlier, most don't talk about death and dying. It is a bit of a taboo subject for a lot of us. I do think it's an issue within society. And I think it's the same with illness as well. When I'm reading a really interesting book at the moment about somebody's experience with dementia and living with dementia, somebody who is quite young in the grand scheme of things, and they have an early onset dementia. And in all honesty, it's completely fascinating. It's seeing the world through their eyes and understanding what it's actually like to have dementia and not be, what's the right word, not be swayed by perhaps what we see in the media, what we see on television, and the real truth behind that. And perhaps it's similar with death as well. When, again, I was listening to a podcast not that long ago, which was talking about how in other cultures, how they experience death and grief and what they do. So some cultures will have a period of really grieving for a set period of time, but it's for want of a better word, it's proper grieving. And the idea being that once you've had that time and you've experienced that and you've allowed yourself to grieve, that's what you're really doing. I think in the UK, a lot of us will put on a brave face, and that might be okay for some. You know, again, it's going to be very individualistic. But I think what happens then, by not talking about it, we don't have the tools to deal with it when it does happen to us. And this is what prevents us from actually making the wills and lasting powers of attorney. But it's something we all have in common. Every single one of us, myself included, obviously we are going to die one day. We don't know when that's going to happen. One of a few certainties in life. And I think that's really quite powerful because we can bond and make connections with people because it's guaranteed for all of us. And this is what happened to me. I went through a period when, so I reached a certain age, and I'm actually a lot older than now, well, a few years older than what this picture shows. But I reached this point where this had actually really dawned on me. And, you know, considering what I do, I've been doing this for a long time, since my early 20s. It hadn't occurred to me, you know, I was making wills and powers of attorney for people, but I hadn't actually addressed it myself. And once I did, it really made me focus in on, well, what do I want to happen during my life? What do I really want? And it did coincide with what's happened over the last few years, but it gave me the courage and the ability to do something which really, trying to think of the right words, which really allowed me to live my best life, is probably the best way of explaining it. You know, I became self-employed. That opened up a lot of opportunities. But it wasn't until I'd started to really engage with death that I began to realize and start to prioritize, well, what is really important to me? But it also connects us with our loved ones. If we're having these conversations, we are getting closer to them and making it easier to talk about it. And when it comes to making our wills, our powers of attorney, we can then start to really delve into it. And I think it is an interesting subject to talk about if you bring it up over the dinner table, for example. You will probably find that it goes off into all sorts of different subjects and can be really quite an interesting experience. There's just a few pictures here of the things I've been doing over the last 2 years since becoming self-employed. It gives me the freedom and flexibility. But we must slow down and reflect on what we really want and give ourselves permission. And I think that can sometimes be the stumbling block, not allowing ourselves to stop and reflect on life because we're too busy living it. But I think there's a lot of insight to be gained from slowing down, reflecting, having these conversations. Let's talk more openly about death. Let's make that normal. You know, let's protect those we leave behind, but also not have any regrets. When we get these two things right, it gets a lot easier. So it begins to come all together. You and your loved ones, you know what to do because you've talked about it. You know how to get started with the planning stage, putting these protections into place. So you know what you will need and, more importantly, how to approach it. And this is what I helped Sandra with. Again, another client experience. And Sandra needed to update her will. So she already had a will in place, but also needed to make powers of attorney. She actually wanted to downsize and move house. And her concern was, well, what was going to happen with her two friends? So she had distant relatives who weren't really in touch. And she wanted her friends, those closest to her, to help her, be her attorneys or executors in a will, but she didn't want to burden them. And what we did is we actually had those conversations with all three of them. So that was a way of giving Sandra's friends the guidance. You know, we discussed and we recorded exactly what Sandra wanted, but also it gave her friends the understanding of what they needed to do. And a lot of the time, if you're an attorney under a lasting powers of attorney, so you're helping a relative or loved one make decisions, or you're an executor in a will, I would probably say the majority of the time people don't know what they're doing. You know, even more so if people are making wills and powers of attorney themselves, they're losing this opportunity to get everybody involved. But it is so, so important because we don't want the people to suddenly be faced with a crisis and not know what to do. So together we worked out a plan, which ultimately meant Sandra no longer felt her friends would be burdened. I mentioned at the start, at the end, I'll talk about my will making process. If you would like a chance to speak to me about creating your plan, who to have conversations with, get some clarity, there's a link here to book in a short session with me where we'll go through those key points. QR code there, which you can use, which will take you through to my calendar to book in an appointment. And I'll leave that QR code on the slides for the rest of the workshops. Okay, my top tips for protection. Give your will and powers of attorney context. Sometimes it helps to have somebody to identify what's important to you and to see the bigger picture. Consider the will and the powers of attorney as more than this document, this legal document that we know we should have, but also engage with death. You know, let's start making these conversations normal and make the decision to do it. You know, I know it's really hard when there is so much going on, you know, and I'm no different. In all honesty, it took me a long time, despite doing this for a job, to make my own will. I have made several wills over the years, but it did take me a few years to actually get to the point of doing it. The truth is, most won't get that far at all, as we've seen with the statistics. So that's part one. Has part one been useful? Let me know. Let me know in the chat. It's an important starting point to make sure that you get the correct advice. So as well as the planning, we need the correct advice for you. And the wills and the powers of attorney, they need to do what you want them to. And that's what part two is all about. So it's focusing in on what you need to do to get them tailored so they are tailored to you, you've got everything in place, and you've got the correct advice. And this is the area that the majority of people I speak to and clients I've helped, they get wrong because unfortunately they are taking and doing other things. So that might be trying to do it too quickly. It might be not spending enough time on it, taking the DIY route, talking to family and friends. I'll touch upon this a bit more in a moment. And there are two things we need to do. So implement and then communication and action. So what do I mean by implement? Well, there's two elements to this. One is a deep dive. The second is getting help. So what do I mean by a deep dive? It's why. So why do you want to make a will and lasting powers of attorney? Why do my clients make wills and lasting powers of attorney? You may be familiar with this concept of why, which gets talked about a fair bit. And I must admit, I'm a bit of a fan of the why in life as well as in our professional lives. But it's so relatable to wills and powers of attorney. What I actually realized was that there was, whenever I helped a client, there was always a reason why they were coming to me to make the wills and powers of attorney. Ironically, that was not always about death. And this is where I'm going to touch upon more of the reasons why it's important. But it was quite a realization to think about this. And, you know, it might be to protect our loved ones, as I've mentioned earlier. So it might be that somebody they have children from previous relationships. They may have a partner and children. Children are not with their current partner. So there's balancing concerns. You know, they might be wanting to protect the business, and that's the driving force, because they want to make sure it can continue to run if they become ill. What's going to happen to their employees? It might be excluding somebody from a will. We often see in the news challenges to wills. And if we are excluding someone, we need to make sure we know what we need to do and get the correct advice for that. It might be divorce. You know, we're going through a relationship breakdown. It might be that we're not married or we've recently married. What effect does that have on a will? We need to make sure we have one, because an unmarried partner or if we are not in a civil partnership, they won't receive anything from our estate. So the rules that we have, the rules of intestacy, as they're called, which set out what happens to our assets, our estate, when we don't have a will, doesn't include an unmarried partner or civil partner. So if we're not married or in a civil partnership, I should say. And, you know, part of this, as I've mentioned earlier, it is about getting the tailored advice. And there's just a few examples of clients I've helped in the past where that's really been a key driving point. And the other reasons, it might be we are thinking about, well, how do we protect our assets from care in later life? It might be that somebody's just passed away, and that's really prompted us to start doing something about this. You know, I've talked a lot about making sure assets go to the correct people, but it's also a great way to organise our finances. So it's not just about, this is what we have when we die. If we get our finances in place, then we've ticked off 2 things on our to-do list. We might be worried what will happen if we become ill, as we've seen with John Paul and Ben. Security and peace of mind, and this lack of control, which a lot of people talk about when they're making a will. You know, again, remember the diagram from earlier. This is what happens if we don't have a will, the complexities of that. The second element to this then is getting help. So what do we mean by getting help? Most think that they can do it themselves, or they take the substandard option. So they may speak to family and friends who've done it before, or they ask Google. We've all been there, done that. And that results in the wrong advice. It's because it's generic. It's not tailored to us. And for wills, there is such a diverse variations of service out there. You know, wills for £20 we often see advertised. The DIY kits. You know, there are lots of people who can help us with this. But we need to take this focused approach and do take legal advice. And I know for some people that won't always be possible, which is why it's fantastic that we do have these alternatives in place. So at least there is something in place. But it takes away a lot from the experience and from making sure it's doing what we want it to do. And helping us, as I've talked about earlier, helping us to, live our best life by engaging with death and talking about these difficult subjects. So I mentioned, again, a few examples there with the advice being tailored, really important for clients and the feedback I receive. And I often think it is one of the most, or if not the most important legal service we will ever use. And that's because of the fact that it's protecting our loved ones, our property, our money, and our income as well. And we need that legal advice to make sure we have the correct documents in place, we have the correct legal wording. We often see, or there's often criticism about how wills are written. We talk about legal language, legal jargon, whatever you want to say. But the truth is there is a need for that to a certain extent, because we don't want things to go wrong and leave our loved ones with a mess to sort out. So that is just as important. And this is what happens when it goes wrong. So this is Tim's story. So an example of the DIY approach. So Tim had made a homemade will. And unfortunately, the correct formalities were not used when signing and witnessing the will. So we do have legal formalities when it comes to making sure the will is legally binding. And why that was really important for Tim was because he wanted his friend to receive his house. Tim was another who had distant relatives who Tim didn't know very well. He wanted a close friend to inherit at least part of his estate, so his house. But because the will was invalid, the estate then was distributed by the rules of intestacy, so the legal rules we have in place when we don't have a will. And it gave the wrong result. It went to family members. And it was a similar story for Mike and his father. So for Mike and his father, they'd actually decided they wanted to make lasting powers of attorney again themselves. They were taking the DIY approach. But by the time they were doing it, Mike's father was unfortunately, his illness, his dementia was worsening. And Mike needed to be able to help his father make decisions, so financial decisions, care decisions. So it might be this, simple steps such as accessing bank accounts and money, so you can pay for expenses, keep the house running. But because of Mike's father's dementia, mental capacity was in doubt. So some of you may be familiar with mental capacity. So the law says we need mental capacity to make a lasting power of attorney. So the understanding of what a power of attorney is and what it does and lots of other things. And if you lacked mental capacity, Mike's father wouldn't be able to make a lasting power of attorney. But I actually helped them to arrange a mental capacity assessment. So somebody who could say, well, actually, yes, Mike does have the mental capacity to make a power of attorney. And that was the case with Mike's father. And it meant that we could complete them. Mike could then help his dad manage his finances, pay his bills, access his bank accounts, help him with decision making, and make sure his father was comfortable so he could live well. And by doing this, it avoids the alternative, which is the court of protection. So if we don't have mental capacity to make a lasting power of attorney, we can go to the court of protection, which is a court supporting people with, or who lack mental capacity. But it's, in all honesty, a long process. It's not an easy process. and it could leave you in limbo. And it's another reason why making our powers of attorney as far in advance as possible will help, because we know they'll be ready for whenever we need them. So there's no delay, you know, we can carry on and make decisions and make sure our finances are managed, or whatever the case may be. So that's implementation. And the second thing we need to do is communication and action. So don't speak to people and ask Google, because as I've said earlier, it's generic advice. It's not going to be tailored to you. Spend the time writing out a list of questions which is important to you. And this will, again, help tease out the detail, tease out the why. And this is what I helped Jill with. So I sent Jill a checklist, so specific points to consider. We could get all the information and tailor my advice to Jill's situation, discover her why, discover her priorities. In Jill's case, her priorities were business, income, partner, family, and a joint property. So Jill was due to marry, so she needed advice about how that was going to affect the will. She had children and a new partner, so there needed to be arrangements in place, so Jill was able to balance the needs of both her partner and the children, but she also wanted to benefit other people in the family. There was also friction, which was why getting into this much detail, again, it's really useful and important. So my top tips for support. So I've talked a lot about why. I won't say any more on that subject. Remember tailoring the advice. You know, the DIY approach will potentially cost more. I do see this, unfortunately, quite often. It's not a good situation to be in. Keep in mind the importance of doing them. And there's a few other points there on the slides which I won't read out. So I'll take a moment, just reflect on those. I think that might be quite useful. And give me a chance to just have a sip of water. So that's part 2. Moving into our final part of the workshop, which is decisions. So once we've done all of that, you can then look at making the decision, pulling it all together, putting it into action to make sure we actually have these protections in place. We're not leaving it, we're not procrastinating about it. And the truth is that most will take a shortcut. We think we can do it ourselves. We're not taking the legal advice. We may think it's simple, doesn't get the attention it deserves. And the fact that people often, and again, this is something I experience in my work, is that people don't always know exactly what they have in place with their wills and powers of attorney, what they do, what they can't do, and what is going to be expected of loved ones who are acting for them, making decisions, being an attorney, being an executor in a will. And there is a better way, and this is my protecting your assets and loved ones process. And it's a lot easier if I, again, illustrate this with an example from Steve and Sue. And there's a few points there regarding Steve and Sue's circumstances. So again, they had a lot of conflicting concerns and a lot going on. Children from previous relationship, they were unmarried. Again, they were business owners and a professional. They had extended families, they had joint and sole assets. They had pets, but they also had a lot of digital assets. They wanted to protect their social media. And social media really is another really important point, an important part of the will making and power of attorney process. So all the work we did together, we was able to uncover why Steve and Sue wanted to make the will and ask for powers of attorney. We were able to work out whether they would need to pay an inheritance tax, see what assets will be part of the will. So because they had joint assets, some will not always be part of a will. So again, this planning, this teasing out the detail, do we need to identify any changes to how assets are owned in order to protect or save tax? We consider the structure of the will. So how can we best protect the assets? And then also consider what will happen to the business if they were to die or become ill. And at this stage, this was where the family tree was really important, because it enabled me to get a full picture of the family, who the loved ones were, who were important to them, identify who's to be included in the will, work out who got what, prioritize the family members who were most important to Steve and Sue, work out and identify the protections they actually needed, and consider the legal implications because they were unmarried. So what do we need to do because of that? And I can't remember if I mentioned this earlier, I may have done, but if if you're not married, then your estate won't automatically pass to a partner, depending on how your assets are structured. But again, a really important point. We did a similar exercise with the powers of attorney. So business planning was really important here. Should they become ill? Who the attorneys were going to be, again, didn't want to burden people unnecessarily. They wanted to make sure they knew what their responsibilities were, help to choose their attorneys. And these are the things you miss if you're doing it yourself, because you can't go into this detail. And I've mentioned there planning for medical decisions, which again is an important part of lasting powers of attorney. I spoke a moment ago about protecting digital assets, protecting our social media accounts should we become ill or pass away. What settings do we need to change? What do we need to put into place to protect them? And again, in all honesty, that's not always considered when people are making wills and powers of attorney. And then all this work, so this enabled me to tailor the wills and powers of attorney. Steve and Sue got the correct advice. And that ensured that they had the correct legal documents in place. They knew they were secure. They didn't need to worry. They didn't need to worry about leaving their loved ones with a mess to sort out. Their wishes were known, and the people who were going to help them also knew what they needed to do. And then the assets would go to correct people. Tax was minimised. And then again, with the powers of attorney, it was making sure the correct people were in place to make decisions for them. What did they need to know to make sure the business could continue to operate? They had that peace of mind. And I mentioned there less stress. And I think this is what I've noticed when, people start the process, they want to do it, but then things get in the way, we procrastinate. It just leads to stress. And I've been there myself. I've experienced that, because it's something else we're constantly thinking about, or it's on our to-do list, something else that we need to do. And then in addition, Steve and Sue had so I organised a free will review and powers of attorney review, which I recommend after 2 years. But changes may not be needed, but it's a way of just reflecting, checking everything is up to date. And my clients are free to contact me within 2 years, or I contact them at the end of 2 years from the date of their wills and powers of attorney. So my top tips, rather, for decisions. So again, enjoy the process of the why. I'll just put those on screen for you to read. Again, I'm not going to read them out. I think the reviewing is an important point, because as well, sometimes people will have a will already but it may need to be updated, or they're perhaps worried that it hasn't been done correctly, or they've attempted it themselves and they're not quite sure if it's tailored to them. That's another opportunity to be able to, you know, again, get the correct advice. So for peace of mind, protection and security for your loved ones, your assets, your business, a tailored solution, advice which is specifically for your circumstances, no mistakes, so you know that those you leave behind, they're not going to have a mess to sort out. Follow this process. Let's not leave it to chance. If this does sound perfect for you, something that you would like to explore, you would like personal help through this process, find out more information, have a conversation around. And I mentioned earlier, booking a call with me using the QR code there on the slides. What we'll actually do, we'll talk through your exact circumstances, get that clarity, pinpoint your why, make an action plan. Because as I mentioned earlier, we don't know what's going to happen to us. None of us knows what's around the corner. If we can get the planning stage, then it's a fantastic start. And it starts the ball rolling. And again, this is my process. And it is quite a thorough process, I have to say. And it, you know, we all work differently. And depending on how you're making your wills, it may not always be the same. And there's just some, again, some testimonials here, client feedback over the years, and some recent testimonials. So as I've mentioned, I do have some calls available. They are on a first come, first served basis. There's 10 calls available to book with me. Again, you can use the QR code there. I'll leave that on screen for a moment. I did say there will be some time for questions, so I am happy to take any questions from anybody. If you could pop those in the Q&A box for me. I'm just having a quick check now. In fact, let me just put that in my view. So, as I say, happy to take any questions. I'll leave this link on the screen. So, whoops, there we go. So again, the QR code there to book a call in my calendar, or there's the link there on screen. So if anybody if you do have any questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A for me. I'd like to leave you with, again, a couple of key takeaways and tips. And I think sometimes this does vary, I have to say, but I think one of the main realizations for me, and something which I think is really helpful for people making wills and powers of attorney, is having those conversations with your loved ones, talking about passing away, talking about illness. It's very, very powerful. And, you know, ultimately, it will help us to prioritize what's important to us. You know, we can live our best life by working out, you know, what do we want to get out of life. A second top tip would be take the time to plan. And I know that probably sounds a little bit counterintuitive. It's something else to do, but it's the only way you'll get the most out of the process. And often it can make the difference to how things will be dealt with after you've gone, making sure everything is correct, helping your loved ones. So it's a key part of the process. And sometimes having the help to do that, so having a professional to make your wills and powers of attorney, will really help to put that into context and help you out to actually get it done. So as I've shown with Steve and Sue, I will work together with my clients. We do spend time in meetings talking about everything. And then my third key takeaway, if you like, is I actually have two. I was going to mention why, because it's really interesting. So if you can uncover your why, that will give you the driving force to do it. So we all have, why do we ultimately want to make a will? There will be a reason which has prompted us to do it. So think about that, write it down, put it on your monitor, whatever, keep it somewhere where you can see it all the time, because that will give you the driving force to actually get it done. And then the fourth, I was going to say, whatever age you are at, it is important to do. So none of us really knows what's going to happen, which I've mentioned before. So if we can get it done earlier rather than later, it does put you at an advantage. It means, particularly for the powers of attorney, if you've got them there ready and waiting, you're not going to have any delays. It means that people can make decisions for you. I often see when people are going through the care situation, to somebody needing care, and that's not just limited to those in later life. It might be because of an illness or an accident, for example. So if you're going through that process, you could have other people making decisions for you. So, for example, social services, it could be doctors, who you may not necessarily want to be the ultimate decision maker. You may want their help and support, but the power of attorney is the only way to make sure that your family and loved ones will be the correct people who can make those decisions. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. I hope that's been useful. Really appreciate it. As I say, there's the option to book a call in with me there. Love to speak to you. No questions are coming in. So if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out. If there's anything you'd like to ask that you haven't felt comfortable asking in an open forum, happy to answer any questions. And that brings us to the end of the workshop. So thank you once again. I will leave it there. Have a great rest of the day. And I hope to see and speak to you very soon. Okay, take